Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome back to another video. So I did an in-depth review of the Nintendo Switch 2 recently, and I went over pretty much everything from the unboxing and setup, hardware, gameplay experience in handheld and docked mode, etc. So I'll link that down in the description below in case you wanted to check it out later. More time has obviously passed since that original review, and I've been using the Switch 2 daily for over a month. In this one, I kind of wanted to summarize and also add a few key points to my previous review that I think are worth knowing, at least in my opinion, about the Switch 2. So whether you're interested in buying one or already have it, here's my list of 10 things I think you should know. To start, Nintendo removed VRR in docked mode from the spec before launch, so it's not currently supported there. Still, as of the making of this video, there isn't any clear reason as to why Nintendo doesn't support this, and they seem to be staying silent on the matter. Here's what I do know. The Switch 2 uses an internal DP 1.4 to HDMI 2.1 converter, which is the Realtek RTD2175N. As mentioned in its name, it's its job to convert the Switch 2's internal DP 1.4 signal into HDMI 2.1 and then pass the signal from the console to the TV. There's not a lot of public information on the 2175N, and I couldn't confirm, at least when I made my review, whether or not the Realtek chipset supported VRR, since VRR is an optional spec of HDMI 2.1. However, after my video was released, The Verge confirmed that the Switch 2 dock does indeed support VRR after testing it by plugging in different handhelds into the dock, including the Steam Deck, Legion Go, and Ally X. If then the dock, and therefore the 2175N, is capable of VRR, then it's hard to understand why Nintendo removed it from the spec. My personal thought is that it could have to do with the DP 1.4 to HDMI 2.1 conversion potentially not playing nicely with VRR, and or Nintendo not trusting all displays to work as intended with VRR. Whatever the case is, I'm hopeful that this feature is still on the roadmap and Nintendo will bring it to us in a future update. Let me know down in the comments below what you think about all of this, as I'd love to hear from you. This leads me into the next point. When I did my initial review of the Switch 2, I was confused as to if the Switch 2 supported HDMI 2.0 or 2.1. This was due to a few reasons. The Switch 2 outputs 4K at 60Hz or 1440p at 120Hz, both with HDR support, which are all supported by good old HDMI 2.0. The fiasco with VRR not being supported also added to my confusion. Now, out of the box, the Switch 2 comes with an ultra high-speed HDMI cable as listed on Nintendo's website. They also list the dock specs as containing an HDMI port with no more specific information. I took a closer look at the output coming from the Switch 2, and the link is using 4 data lanes, each running at 6 gigabits per second for a total of 24 gigabits per second of bandwidth, which exceeds HDMI 2.0's 3 data lanes and max bandwidth of 18 gigabits per second. This means that the Switch 2 is using FRL3, which is HDMI 2.1's first level data mode. It's effectively a pipe that can carry any one video format that fits inside its 24 gigabits per second limit. 2 common formats that fit inside this limit are 4K 120Hz at 10-bit 420 or 4K 60Hz at 10-bit 444 chroma. Nintendo uses the latter, likely to guarantee the system menu and other still images look sharp on every 4K TV without any chroma subsampling. Note that 444 chroma only exists when HDR is enabled. It also lets the Switch 2 run at cooler temps due to the easier to manage 4K at 60Hz versus the fussier 4K at 120Hz, which the Switch 2 does not support. So from a feature checklist, it looked like HDMI 2.0, but under the hood, the dock is running the lowest speed tier of HDMI 2.1 signaling, and that's why I felt confused. Speaking of 120Hz, while testing out the Switch 2, I was initially confused as to how it handled 60 versus 120Hz. Not necessarily technically, but how it decided when it uses 60 versus 120. For example, take Cyberpunk. Since Cyberpunk uses 120Hz only on performance mode, which is an in-game option, I checked whether or not I could turn on performance mode on the TV while I had the 120Hz toggle disabled in the Switch 2's main settings. It looks like the Switch 2 or the game is smart enough to detect that I have the 120Hz toggle off, so Cyberpunk's toggle for changing the TV in-game mode becomes grayed out. Vice versa, enabling Nintendo's 120Hz option toggles performance mode back on in-game, even if quality mode is selected. What's interesting is that changing the in-game option back to quality while the Nintendo toggle is on doesn't change the resolution back to 4K. It stays at 1440p. So you can end up in this weird state where the game is set to quality mode, but you're still technically running at 1440p and 40 frames per second. Another example is Street Fighter 6. Now, this game can technically run at 120 frames per second in very specific areas of the game, even if the main fights happen at 60 frames per second. It turns out that if a game supports 120Hz in any way, then the Switch 2 runs the game at 1440p and 120Hz. This means that if you went out, bought Street Fighter 6, threw it in docked mode, and started playing it, you might not be aware that the game is running in 1440p and not in 4K if you left the 120Hz toggle on. On the flip side, for a game like Mario Kart World, which caps at 60Hz, enabling 120Hz doesn't do anything, which is expected. The conclusion that I've come to is that I'd recommend turning off Nintendo's 120Hz toggle, which is enabled out of the box by default, unless you're absolutely certain that a game supports it and you want to play a game at that refresh rate. Otherwise, just opt for the better image. For you audiophiles out there, you should be aware that the Switch 2 is limited to 5.1 channel linear PCM over HDMI. It does not send Dolby Digital, DTS, or Atmos for audio output, which might be a deal breaker for some of you. Sony also released the PS5 without support for Dolby Atmos, at least for games, but they later added it with a software update, albeit almost 3 years later. Due to the licensing fees associated with Atmos, it's not clear if Nintendo will add support here, though its CPU is definitely more than capable of handling Atmos's encoding overhead. Speaking of the Switch 2's CPU, it sits on NVIDIA's new Drake SoC, the Tegra T239. Now on the chip is an ARM Cortex A78C CPU with 8 cores, which is an upgrade over the previous Switch 1's A57 with 4 cores. A weird spec that I noticed with the A78C is that it runs at 1.1 GHz in handheld mode and around 1 GHz or 998 MHz in docked mode. Yes, you heard that correctly. The Switch 2 runs at a lower clock speed when docked and higher when in handheld. I'm not sure why, but my assumption is that Nintendo might not want you picking up a hot console from the dock.
Thomas from the editing future here. Yep, I still don't get it.
If you've got any thoughts on this one, let me know. Maybe I'm missing something completely. It's not a big deal, but I did think it was worth a shout out. Speaking of things that's worth a shout out, let's talk about the Switch 2's massive 7.9-inch screen, which does have support for VRR up to 120 Hz. Now, it's not a secret that the Switch 2 doesn't ship with an OLED screen, but what some people might not realize is that there's also no full array local dimming with the LCD screen that it does ship with. Why does this matter? Well, it means that even though the Switch 2's screen supports HDR10 and is heavily advertised as such, with no local dimming whatsoever, you're certainly not going to be getting true HDR performance, at least in handheld mode. The other issue here is that the Switch 2's display has a peak brightness of 450 nits, which simply isn't bright enough to show a great HDR image. Another thing I found interesting with the screen is that it's both durable and not durable at the same time. It has the ability to be smashed several times without breaking. However, new tests done by Zach over at Jerry Rig Everything shows that due to the plastic screen protector included with the device, it can show visible scratches when it comes into contact with anything greater than 3 on the Mohs scale, like keys or even coins. I would recommend getting a screen protector with the Switch 2, even a third-party one, for this exact reason. The Switch 2 is backwards compatible with the Switch 1, which is awesome, but one thing to keep in mind is that Switch 1 games ran in 720p in handheld mode, whereas the Switch 2 has a 1080p screen, so games need to scale from 720p to 1080p, which isn't the most ideal. Well, why is that? Well, scaling can get somewhat complicated, but the simple reason is that scaling 720p to 1080p is a 1.5 times stretch, so each real pixel falls halfway between 2 new pixels. The scaler will do something like fill those gaps by averaging neighboring colors, and that smoothing can make edges and text in Switch 1 games look a bit soft on the Switch 2. Keep in mind that some Switch 1 games like Monster Hunter Rise were already being upscaled from 540p in handheld mode, so playing it on the Switch 2 in docked mode means it would be upscaled twice. Not all games look bad on the Switch 2, and I think depending on the game's textures, your mileage will vary. For example, Super Mario Bros. U still looks good in both handheld and docked mode on the Switch 2, whereas a game like Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, with its textures, definitely looks better to me on the original Switch. The honest truth is that Switch 1 games will always look best on the Switch OLED. Speaking of the Switch OLED, maybe it's just me, but I much prefer the tilt stand on the OLED versus the Switch 2. Frankly, I'm a bit disappointed in the Switch 2's stand, and the first time that I pulled it out from the device, I thought I was gonna break it. Overall, it feels a bit cheap and flimsy, at least to me. Is it a step up from the Switch 1? Sure, but that's not really much to brag about. While the stand isn't completely awful and gets the job done, I just wish that it was at least on par with the Switch OLED stand. It's worth noting that the Switch 2's advantage is that you can charge the device while it's in tabletop mode, while the Switch OLED can't be charged since there's only one charging port at the bottom. The last, but nonetheless important thing I want to touch on in this video is pricing, which is grinding everyone's gears. I'm up in Canada, so all of these are in Canadian dollars. As of the making of this video, the Switch 2 retails at $630 for the base console and $700 for the Mario Kart World Bundle, making it the most expensive Nintendo console at launch. To put it into perspective, in 2017, the Switch 1 launched for $400, and even taking into account inflation, is still more than I would have expected. One thing, however, to keep in mind are Switch 2 production costs. The Financial Times reported that it costs $338 US or 465 Canadian dollars just for the materials to produce a single Switch 2 in Vietnam. So it's claimed that with additional costs thrown in, Nintendo only makes around $4 US of profit per Switch 2 unit sale. Lately in the video game industry, it feels like most of the additional revenue is made from video game sales, accessories, subscriptions, and so forth. I point this out not really in defense of Nintendo, but to offer another perspective as to why the Switch 2 is priced how it is. Games, however, especially first-party titles, are at all-time high prices, with Mario Kart World retailing for an insane 110 Canadian dollars. So personally, the console prices make some sense to me, but the video game prices still don't. Drop me a comment below how you feel about pricing. We may be opening up Pandora's box, but I'm always interested to hear your opinions. Overall, it might seem like I'm taking a negative view of the Switch 2, especially since all of the points I've just listed seem that way. Again, these are just things that I think you should know about the Switch 2, ideally if you're still on the fence and wondering if you should get one. The truth is that I've continued to have fun playing and testing out the Switch 2. Mario Kart World is really fun. I've been playing it for hours, though I do know some people hate it, and Breath of the Wild for the Switch 2 is a standout for me. Also, the fact that a Nintendo console can run Cyberpunk and have it look good is still crazy. Overall performance is definitely better, with the new ARM Cortex CPU doubling the core count and swapping out the old Maxwell GPU for an Ampere design with over 1500 CUDA cores, boosting throughput from the original Switch's half a teraflop to about 3 teraflops on the Switch 2 in docked mode. The new UFS 3.1 storage quickens load times, while higher clocks and DLSS upscaling free GPU headroom, letting new titles run at steadier frame rates and, when developers choose, load higher res textures. Last, even with its bigger screen, the larger triggers and buttons make the Switch 2 fairly palatable to play for long hours, and I don't find it terrible ergonomically compared to the Switch 1 and Switch OLED. I bought the Switch 2 primarily to review it for all of you. However, the bottom line is that if I was looking to buy the Switch 2 right now, purely for entertainment and enjoyment, as most people are, as much fun as I've had with it and the improvements that have been made, I probably wouldn't. At least, not right now. Given the prices, the fact that there aren't a whole lot of Switch 2 titles out right now, I would hold off on getting it for the time being. I don't think that the Switch 2, at its current price, with its current offerings, is worth the money right now. Down the line, with some newer titles coming out and a more stable ecosystem of games, I can see this being a great Nintendo device. However, right now, there's just not enough there for me to recommend it and to justify paying some of these crazy prices. That's about all I have for this one, guys. I do hope that you found this video helpful. If you're still here, thank you for the privilege of your time. I appreciate it as always. Drop me a Gerudo Valley down below, just so I can give you a like for sticking around until the end of the video. If you like this video, you know what to do. Please remember to hit that like button, and please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon so you know when I release new videos. Also, please consider sharing the video if you think this will be interesting or helpful to someone else. Doing all of the YouTube things really does help me out in growing this small channel. I've got more tech, desk setup, and gaming content planned as usual, so please stay tuned for that. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.